thank you everybody for joining us for this second webinar in our series where we invite leading academics to share their thoughts, research and findings with us. These are very much webinars focused on academic output and translating that, in a sense, stitching that together with people who maybe are in the practitioner and policy space, so we can then have a really joined up conversation that goes really from research into, well, what does that mean and what should we do? So that's what we're trying to do with this. There will be time for question and answers after our guest speaker, Sophie King-Hill, who is, which I'm delighted to welcome. Dr. Sophie King-Hill, she's an associate professor at the School of Social Policy and Society at the University of Birmingham. She specialises in sexual behaviours and assessment in children and young people, sexual health, sibling sexual behaviour and abuse, relationships and sex education, the importance of youth voice and masculinity and young men and boys. And she's just published a new book, Reframing Masculinity for Young Men and Boys. We're in this together alongside a suite of accompanying resources aimed at parents, carers, educators and professionals. She is, I think, quite a rare example of an academic that not only does the research but also wants to put that into practice. She's a genuine expert in her field, and she's going to be talking to us for around 40 minutes. Sophie, would you say? Something like that. She's got some slides to share, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers afterwards. So without me babbling on any longer, I'm going to hand over to Sophie to talk to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me and inviting me along. It's really vitally important that we have these conversations, and especially now, I do think there's a lot of momentum in this field and this arena that we've got to keep pushing and we've got to keep going, even though we are meeting some really good targets at the moment with men and boys in terms of getting that public discourse changed. We have got to keep the momentum going, and for me that's vitally important. However, today I'm going to talk to you about reframing masculinity for young men and boys and talk about the main premise of the book that I've written and the free resources that come with it. So by way of introduction, I'm an associate professor at the University of Birmingham, as has already been said. I'm also the head of equity, diversity and belonging for the School of Social Policy and Society. And this is a really interesting role because I've been able to bring my insight that I've gained from doing work in the masculinity and young men and boys space to really recognise that EDB and EDI is not just about minority groups, and we really need to draw in intersectionality into these conversations, which I think is starting to happen. I don't think we're quite there yet, but these conversations are being recognised, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about intersectionality as the talk goes on. And I've got a background in the third sector. So before I was an academic, so I've been an academic for 10 years. I worked in this third sector. So I worked for Brook Charity as their National Impact Coordinator. I also taught relationships and sex education in schools to children across the region from age 4 to 18. Prior to that, I worked with teenage parents. That was 20 years ago. And I always say, that's a job that I miss because those young people were so inspirational. And before that, I worked with young men and boys in the criminal justice system. So that's the last 20 years of my career in about 30 seconds there. I've carried out a number of research projects that relate to sexual behaviours of children and young people and all of the kind of aspects that surround that. But the projects that I've carried out that relate directly to masculinity and men and boys are listed below. So I've just finished an Understanding Incel Behaviour project whereby Reddit posts were analysed and looked at. One of the interesting things about that project is going into that, I was preparing myself to read some pretty awful things. You really have to steel yourself when working in this arena because you will read things that could be potentially upsetting. However, I didn't prepare myself for the sadness that I felt for the young men and boys that were on these forums searching for direction and searching for identity and that kind of self-hatred that they had. And I think we need to shine a slightly different light on young men and boys that get tipped into these forums in terms of how we can support them and actually what's led them to that point. Another project that's recently come to an end that I was leading is the sexual behaviours of 13 to 18-year-olds in the UK. There was a large-scale survey, analysis of helpline data, and a scoping review as part of that. But one of the key findings relating to young men and boys that was really critical to me and the way that I looked at things was the sexual behaviours of 13 to 18-year-old young men and boys are very vastly different. You know, there's an assumption within society that young men and boys are sexually driven, that they are the instigators, and young women and girls often, if we're talking about heterosexual relationships, are the gatekeepers. However, the research that I carried out has shown that that's just not true. You know, there are sexual motivators for behaviour, but also there are a lot of young men and boys that have lots of different experiences around sex and sexual behaviours. And I've recently written a commentary that's for the centre's website that talks about how we need to change the discourse on consent for young men and boys. Last year I completed a project on masculinity in the fire service. This was a real fascinating look at how masculinity plays out in male-dominated professions. And that was quite interesting in terms of looking at workplace culture and how a lot of men don't feel listened to, but don't have a space to say they don't feel listened to. And I'll unpack that a little bit shortly. I'm going to talk to you in depth about the We're in This Together project, which is the namesake of the book. So I won't go into that in too much depth. I've also produced a relationships and sex ed resource, primarily with young men aged 14 and 15. That's a free resource advising leadership teams in schools and teachers how to teach relationships and sex education. I carried out a youth voice graffiti project on campus on 2 big 24-foot boards to try to look at different ways to engage young men and boys, but also create a platform where their voices could be heard. And I've got one of the projects that is really close to my heart is a sexual health and period poverty project I've got in West Africa, in Sierra Leone, where we've been looking at the motivators for relationships and sex education and for sexual health workers. And I've been so incredibly inspired by the men and boys out there that are really advocating for this kind of education. And on one of the walls of the NGOs, it's got written, "You don't have to be anti-man to be pro-woman." And I think we stand to learn a lot from that position. So, as alluded to, I've got my book is coming out within the next month. So it's Reframing Masculinity for Young Men and Boys. And I'm going to talk about the main aspects of the premise of the book within this talk. It's got an associated free resource with that's out now. You can get that from my university staff page, or just drop me an email, or I'm sure Nick and Mark might be able to supply this in an email to everyone. So this is a resource for parents, carers, educators and professionals that breaks down all the main components of the book into a kind of easy read format and a practical application on how we can use these concepts to work effectively with young men and boys. One of the things that I wanted to set out before I go into the main aspects of the book are these kind of perspectives we've got within society at the moment. There is a public discourse around retribution, you know, that women and girls have largely had not a very good time over the last 50 years or so. But there is this discourse around retribution, you know, men should pay for this. Well, actually, this is a very damaging position to have. And it's not only damaging for men and boys, it's also damaging for women and girls and other genders. Because blame culture shuts down dialogue. So men feel attacked, so they don't engage. You know, I see this in the work that I do time and time again. It's really frustrating. And this isn't an apologist position. You know, women are overwhelmingly beaten, raped, murdered and die by suicide because of men. We know there's a violence problem with men. You know, men suffer violence from other men and boys. So we know what's happening, but however, to just say it's your fault, but you cannot be part of the solution is incredibly damaging. So we need to try and shift away from that blame culture. It creates a defensiveness and a backlash. So it leads to resistance to progress. And it misses the root cause. You know, if we really want to solve issues, we need to look at the complexity around it. And we need a better approach. We need collaboration, education, and we need to reframe masculinity as inclusive, because at the moment it's become quite a dirty word, hasn't it? You know, it's very rare you hear it associated with anything positive. And the goal is to change things through understanding, not through punishment. And I think, you know, the key thing we've got to remember at the moment, nobody's winning. And by that, no gender's winning. Women aren't winning. You know, the trans and non-binary folk, they're certainly not winning at the moment, but neither are men and boys. And I think that aspect is missing from the conversation. You know, it's not allyship. We've got to work together and we've got to support each other. Another point I want to make before I go into the crux of the talk is that, you know, we're quite often set up within society to look for differences within our, you know, between genders. Okay, so, but one of the things I want to bring it back to, and I make this point in the book, is that we are more the same than we are different. Biologically, we are more the same than we are different. There are biological aspects that are different, but in the main, we are more the same. You know, we all have the same emotional response to things. You know, but we're set up within society to see that as different. You know, from the minute that we're born into this construction of gender and how we're meant to act. And, you know, that applies for men and boys as well. And this perspective is not implied by society. So I think we need to take a step back and recognise across genders, we are all this, you know, we are more the same than we are different. And I think if we keep that in our mind as we do work with men and boys, I think it really makes things easier if we can reframe things that way. I also, in true academic form, want to define my terms. So when I talk about masculinity, I'm talking about a set of attributes, behaviours and roles that are often associated with boys and men. Okay, so not always, you know, there are some masculine traits that we can see in women. So it's not just defined to the male gender, but it's a social construct. So it's influenced by culture, history and context. So in the book, I look back historically, you know, from hunter-gatherer times, how the gender roles have evolved and how masculinity has kind of embedded itself within our social structures. And there are some traits that are linked to biology and testosterone and various different biological makeup of men, but most of the ideas around masculinity and how people act come from the outside in, so they're shaped by society. So, and it's really underpinned by these traditional norms of strength, dominance, and this emotional restraint, which can be really incredibly damaging for men as well as women. And intersectionality, you know, masculinity varies across cultures, classes and identities. However, quite often it's lumped into the same definition within society, but it shapes gender roles and expectations, and it impacts quite adversely on mental health, relationships, but also feeds back into those social structures. Ranwen Connell, one of the key theorists in this area, asserted that there were different types of masculinities. So the hegemonic masculinities, the culturally ideological form of masculinity that legitimizes male dominance. So it's dominant, it reinforces patriarchy. And the examples of that are men that are physically strong, assertive, heterosexual, successful, and emotionally reserved. My working class non-academic mother would call them the top dog. Okay, so it's that kind of, you're at the top of the hierarchy. And then there are subordinate types of masculinity. So masculinities that are directly oppressed or seen as inferior by this kind of hegemonic masculinity. So gay men or men that are emotional or especially nurturing. And then there's a complacent form of masculinity. So men who don't fully embody that hegemonic trait, you know, the top dog traits, but they're supportive of these norms within society. So they might be middle class family men who accept gender norms, so as in the traditional male, but aren't aggressive or dominant. And then we have marginalised masculinity. So the masculinities of men who might be excluded due to race, class or disability, such as working class men, men of colour or disabled men. So that these were the things that Connell brought up in her theories. However, as in everything within social science and the theoretical underpinnings of things like gender, there are some critiques to that. So it's a model, it's not a fixed rule. And I think Connell herself said this. Masculinity is fluid and diverse. People may not identify with any of those categories or might have components of those categories. It doesn't fully capture non-binary or gender fluid identities and might ignore individuality. So an alternative view to this is masculinity might be seen as a spectrum, you know, shaped by personal, cultural and social factors. And we might be different in different circumstances. You know, our identity and the way that we act is not fixed. You know, the way that I act when I'm playing with my children, for example, is very different to the way that I act at work when I'm doing a piece of very serious research. So you know, our identity is fluid within this as well. Another concept that I talk about in the book when I talk about especially the digital and online spaces is this concept of precarious masculinity. And this precarious masculinity consists of 3 stages. So to get to that status of top dog that I talked about, that hegemonic status that's seen as the kind of epitome of being male within Western society, you've got to gain that status. So you've got to overtly show dominance over others to get there. And then when you get there and when you reach the pinnacle of this point, you've got to maintain it because it's hard won and it's easily lost. It can be a very stressful position to be in. And you maintain it by demonstrating status. So that might be overt violence against other men and boys, or sexual harassment against women and girls to subordinate them, to elevate self. I'm not saying sexual harassment is always about precarious masculinity and maintaining status. You know, sometimes it is about sexual gratification, but I think as practitioners and experts in the field, we need to take a step back and recognise that sometimes overt sexual harassment isn't for sexual gratification, it is to maintain status as a male. But it's complex, isn't it? Masculinity, it's, as I said, you know, it's a spectrum, it's not simple. Masculine identity is strongly linked to sexual behaviour, you know, so that's quite often why the two are intertwined when we have these conversations. And as I said, it's an abstract concept and it's linked to societal performance. So that those 3 stages I just talked about, it's demonstrating this performance to maintain status. It's seen as this kind of cultural capital that young men should strive for. You know, it's at the moment within society, it's seen as being the best you can be as a man within that kind of hegemonic space. Sexual harassment, as I said, and violence is often linked to the perception of the ultimate male. And that's because, as I said, it's an overt demonstration of status and to keep hold of that status. And as I said, sexual harassment demonstrates power to other males, not just gratification. Another thing that I want to talk about that I kind of talk about within the book and the work that I do is this idea of privilege. You know, privilege to me is quite a loaded word. It's really interesting when we meet someone within society as human beings, we tend to see their gender, the colour of their skin, and if they're able-bodied or not. You know, everything else about who we are is hidden, isn't it? And I'll come on to that with intersectionality shortly. So this means that the idea of privilege is probably quite often directed at people that don't feel very privileged. And I think we have to be very careful around this word of privilege. So just to define what privilege means, it's not about having an easy life. It's about what you don't have to think about. You know, so the societal structural barriers that are in the way for some people might not be in the way for others. But being a man isn't always a privilege. If it means hiding pain or never asking for help or proving strength 24/7, this can be quite damaging and it's not a privileged position. You know, I often think anecdotally of the work that I do in our medical school on sexual violence when teaching the students over there. And I think of the young men there, you know, they come from wealthy backgrounds, they're high achievers, they're generally quite high up in the sports societies. You know, I can't imagine the immense amount of pressure that those young men must feel. However, they are set out to be privileged, but it's a very difficult position to hold. But if you're never questioned, interrupted or doubted, that's privilege. And that applies to all of us. Privilege doesn't make people bad, but ignoring it just makes the system worse. But one of the things I want to bring it back down to and boil it down to again, are the things that I unpack in the book is masculinity a gift or a trap? Society tells us it's a gift, doesn't it? Society tells us that men are privileged. However, if we look at some of these aspects, so if we look at work and leadership, privilege works for men because they're more likely to be hired or promoted. Privilege fails men in this respect because there's a pressure to succeed, and failure might equal shame and feelings of shame and not living up to that male, that male ideology. Wages. So we know there's higher than average pay for men than there are for women, for example. However, low income men still really struggle. Politics, they're overrepresented in power. However, in politics, if they show vulnerability, it equals weakness, which again can be really, really damaging for people. In dating, they've got a socially dominant role. However, quite often their emotional needs are overlooked. And again, you know, it links back to the piece that I wrote for the centre on consent. You know, people never talk about young men and boys around consent and if they do want to take part in sexual activity. So that's one example there. The legal system, they have credibility in disputes. However, they have harsher criminal sentences. And, you know, the bottom line is we've got more men in prison, massively disproportionately more men in prison than women or trans and non-binary people. And that's something we've really got to think about, because I think these things within society, we're so used to them that we don't seem to focus on them as much anymore. And that's why the work of the centre is so valuable. Parenting, they're trusted disciplinarians, but the courts tend to favour mothers in custody trials. Mental health, they're seen as strong and resilient, but there's a stigma around seeking help, and suicide's the biggest killer of men under 45. Interestingly as well, in the book I talk about mental health issues for young men and boys. 50% of men's mental health issues present at age 15 and 75% by the age of 24. So that's why it's so vitally important to be doing work at a very young age in terms of mental health and looking after young men and boys. Education, they're encouraged in STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, maths, but there's higher dropouts and suspension rates and higher exclusion rates within schools. Violence and combat, they're seen as brave and protective, but they're often drafted when we look at other countries, and there's higher injury and death risks for them. Abuse victimhood, so they're less likely to be targeted for sexual abuse. But when they have been abused, there's a tendency to not believe them or support them adequately as a man if they have been victimised in that space. So already we can see this kind of privilege is not as simple as it looks, or as simple as the kind of rhetoric within society might lead us to believe. So masculinity and marginalisation, some men do feel marginalised, you know, some men do feel that there's an unfairness of position for them, but they don't feel that they're able to articulate that within the social spaces we've got at the moment. They feel silenced, afraid to speak up, and worried they'll be labelled or punished. You know, I feel there's still a long way to go for women and girls, but I feel, you know, I can verbalise when I think something is marginalising me in a way that perhaps a man couldn't. But it doesn't mean we're ignoring sexism and misogyny. It means we recognise that the current system isn't working for any of us. And I think one thing as well that's quite often lost within public discourse, and especially in rhetoric, is that patriarchy hurts men as well. You know, there's only really the top 2% earners of men that benefit from these patriarchal systems that we have within society. So the changing role of the man. So over the last 50 years, the role of the woman and the evolution of the role of the woman has been largely supported. So we've got access to safe abortion, we've got bodily autonomy, so through things like contraception, we're a key part of the labour market, and we don't need a man in that traditional sense, you know, to run a household, to be the main earner. There's still a long way to go, so I want to caveat that, you know, we're not at a place where we can feel that things are completely equitable, but we're able to verbalise this and vocalise it and get the support that we need. But there has, and that already over the last 50 years, has been a lot of support in this arena. However, when we look at the last 50 years, that's missing for men and boys. You know, there hasn't been a support in this changing role, you know, and many young men and boys feel really conflicted about where their identity lies within a household and within the workforce and within families, you know, because we haven't recognised the work that needed to be done alongside the work that's been done with women and girls. So I think we need to take a step back and have a real think about that when we think about young men and boys that are possibly influenced by toxic influencers, which I'll come on to shortly. As I said, I wanted to talk about intersectionality. So the importance of recognising intersectionality is vital, really. You know, gender identity doesn't exist in a vacuum. As I said, you're not just a man, you're not just a woman. That forms part of all of the puzzle pieces that make you who you are, that intersect with race, class, sexuality, neurodivergence, life experiences, religion, values. And not all men experience masculinity the same way. And looking at things through an intersectional lens helps us understand all of these layered experiences. I wanted to talk a little bit, as I said, about my project on young men and boys, and in particularly the themes that came out of it and where the research stemmed from. So I started looking at the context of sexual harassment probably around 2021 in any great depth. So when looking at the data, sexual harassment in schools is rising, although reporting might be going up as well, because that seems there's been a lot more focus on that and awareness raising. But the data on peer abuse indicates it's disproportionately carried out by boys and young men against girls and young women. There was the Ofsted report in 2021 that said that sexual harassment was an everyday occurrence within schools, and a culture shift was needed to tackle the issue. In 2020, out of 83,000 child sexual abuse offences that were recorded by police, so remember these are the recorded ones, so it's going to be higher, a quarter of them were carried out by someone under the age of 18. The highest rates and reports of sexual abuse to those under 25 come from girls aged 15 to 17. And the Everyone's Invited website that invites testimonials of sexual harassment within schools and colleges has received over 50,000 of these testimonials since March 2021. So I started looking at this issue and thinking, right, we've got a problem. But then when I started looking at the research out there and the work that was being done, we're not going to the boys and saying, look, this is happening. We know this is happening. How can we fix it? Why is it happening? You know, nobody seemed to be going to young men and boys to try to problem solve. Another kind of aspect of this that I wanted to highlight is that people talk about rape culture. So when we're talking about terminology, people talk about sexual harassment and sexual violence in schools and call it rape culture. However, for me, it's quite a problematic term because it minimises other types of sexual harassment behaviours such as upskirting, derogatory jokes, etc. Rape culture was a phrase termed by a sociological movement in the US in the 1970s. It absolutely has its place. However, I would raise that it probably doesn't have its place when we're talking about sexual harassment and violence in schools. And I think the discourse needs to change around that. I also saw alongside all of this that there was a blame culture that I alluded to earlier for young men and boys. You know, it was always their fault. They were shut out of conversations. And as I said, you know, blaming somebody shuts down very vital dialogue because it pushes people into a defensive position. And it's as if you feel you have to pick a side. There was also the rise of online hate culture that I was witnessing around that time. So at that time, the Centre for Countering Digital Hate showed that traffic to 3 of the largest incel sites grew from 114,000 in March 21 to 638,000 in the November of that year. You know, so that to me, that's a real disproportionate increase over a very short period of time. But that's because young men and boys feel isolated more and they're spending more time online and they're increasingly feeling marginalised. But I think as well, we've got to remember it's impossible to police the internet. You know, we do need to do things around the internet, but also really the focus needs to be on caring for and understanding and supporting young men and boys in this space. There was also the rise of these two, Tate and Peterson. There's also other very damaging influences out there now, but these are the two most well-known ones. But when I talked about the 50-year problem in the making, is when we look at people like Peterson and Tate, they've done us a favour in a way. You know, they're very bad. You know, their ideals and their ideologies are very poisonous. However, they've woke us up. They've made us think, oh my gosh, what's going on? Why are so many young men and boys following the things that they're saying? And that's because over the last 50 years, as I said, we'd largely neglected the changing role of the man and boy. And so we've left a vacuum into which people like this can get traction because many young men and boys are looking for direction. You know, they're kind of freewheeling at the moment and they're looking for identity and reassurance, and people like this come along and give them that. So the project itself, so as I said, it stemmed from a lack of boys' perspective and voice and perceptions of masculinity. And I wanted to construct a picture of how boys perceive identity and boyhood and masculinity. In terms of the methodology, initially there were 3 focus groups, one of 14 to 16-year-olds, one of 16 to 19-year-olds, and one of 13 to 14-year-olds. A huge array of different demographics. Some had been excluded from a number of different schools. There were boys of colour, there were middle-class boys within that. And I expanded that in stage 2, where I carried out 16 focus groups with 2 groups of boys aged 15 and 16 within those demographics. So one of the groups came from a school where a lot of young men had been excluded from a number of different educational provisions, and the other group came from quite a affluent school, and lots of boys of colour within that, and different religious and value perspectives. So in terms of the themes that came out of it, I mean, there were lots of different things that were so interesting and so fascinating when I gave young men and boys a safe space to talk safely without sticking to a social script, and with talking about the things that they really felt about who they are. And there were 4 main themes that came out of this research. One of them, interestingly, was grievance. So many young men and boys felt aggrieved. Okay, and I've seen this across my other projects. You know, there's a grievance because they feel like they're always blamed. They feel like it's always their fault. And if they're feeling aggrieved and feeling this feeling of grievance, they're never going to feel empathy or not never going to feel empathy. That was a bit of a big statement, but it's very difficult to feel empathy when you feel like other genders are getting at you, or you're being blamed because of one part of your identity. But I think this is a very dangerous one as well, and one that we really need to tackle in society from lots of different levels. You know, we need lots of different interventions. We need primary, secondary and tertiary interventions, you know, to kind of look at this grievance. And we need to start young. We need to be talking about identity in a really positive way for young men and boys in primary schools. And then there were really clear examples of that hegemonic, that kind of top dog persona and precarious masculinity. You know, that was a key theme that ran through all of the focus groups, that was really evident. You know, you could see this constant battling for the top space. And one of the more sad aspects of the themes was the conflict between the internal self and the external self. So the internal self being that intersectional identity, all of those little puzzle pieces that make them who they are, is who, you know, that's their identity. However, that seemed to be in direct conflict with the external expectations of young men and boys today. So there was this kind of identity conflict between who they are and who they felt that they had to portray they are. And this didn't just stop face to face, you know, in the physical world. You know, this was also online as well. And I think, you know, quite often at my age, at 46, it's easy to separate online and offline worlds, but when it comes to young people, they live their lives seamlessly online and offline. So they can't shut the front door on things like this, and they're constantly being told they need to prove themselves. Another one of the themes and findings within the research was hopelessness and worthlessness. You know, they felt hopeless because they had no direction, and they felt worthless because they felt within society they were always being blamed for issues without any kind of perspective on how to work with men and boys to look at the problems within society. So they were the 4 main themes that came out of that specific research. However, I have seen very clear echoes of these in the other research projects that I've carried out that I talked about at the start. Some other aspects that have come out of my work with young men and boys and my research, there's the lack of voice. So boys' experiences. Harassment also happens to them. There are lots of stories about young men and boys being touched or having derogatory jokes at them and reporting that to teachers or authority figures, and it just being brushed off or laughed at. And also not being able to kind of talk about that in an arena, even if it really did bother them. Again, you know, they talked about consent, the young men and boys, and they said, you know, we cannot say no. You know, they were very, in a heterosexual relationship, they were very aware that a girl would feel rejected if they said no, because boys are set up to be the instigators and set up to be sexually driven within society. That's the perceptions. But there is no space for them to not consent. So one of the key kind of sub-themes that came out is that the young men and boys would maneuver the girl into saying no. So say things like, are you sure? You don't have to. And if she wanted to then carry on with it, they would they would go through with the sexual act, even if they didn't want to. And this is, we've got to shift public discourse around this issue. Male mental health, in part caused by the expectations that as males, they should not articulate emotional pressure. And, you know, they were so articulate about this. You know, they really had a lot of agency and awareness around this perception of worthlessness of the male, and all the voices needed to be heard, but they also knew that there was a problem with them saying it as men and boys. The impact of pornography they talked about, but also that there's no safe spaces for them to talk about pornography either. You know, that they can't go and say that they either intentionally or unintentionally saw something in porn that they really need to unpack, so they kept it within themselves. The blame culture I talked about, so not your issue, but it's your fault, perceptions of male, and also the peer pressure that links to the precarious masculinity I talked about earlier. It was really interesting throughout this project and the other research projects that men and boys are very clearly aware that there's an unfairness of this position, of this blanket blame that causes resentment, but they're very, very aware that it's dangerous almost to talk about that as a man, to say things are unfair. So they were, without sounding like a male apologist, so they were very cautious around this. And there were feelings about being judged and silenced, both by peers and everyone else. And they were really clear about the need for specific support for young men and boys, because they're seen as potential perpetrators. They're not seen as deserving. And again, like I said, they demonstrate so much agency around articulating these points. But bringing it back to the premise of the book. So the book was called Reframing Masculinity for Young Men and Boys. So I thought it'd be useful to set out in true academic form what I mean when I talk about reframing. So reframing frames the shape of an interpretation. So it frames cognitive frameworks, frames our cognitive frameworks that influence how we understand and navigate social realities around us. But reframing can change perspectives. So it involves viewing a problem from a different angle, altering its emotional or conceptual context. So when we look at masculinity as a frame, how masculinity is framed affects perceptions of young men and boys, and it influences identity and support they can get. Negative framing has consequences. So in the West, current narratives often frame masculinity negatively, as I alluded to earlier, which has an impact and leads to poorer outcomes. Reframing promotes conscious thinking, you know, so it encourages us all to step back and think, you know, how do we view young men and boys? And just from an academic point of view, it aligns with CBT principles about changing negative cognitions into positive ones. But I think with any work with young men and boys, you've got to start with yourself. I've seen this over the last 20 years of my career. Take a step back and think, how do I really feel about young men and boys? When I'm presented with a young man who's perhaps within the criminal justice system, or has displayed some pretty violent behaviour at school, or is already suffering consequences of a domestic violence household, you know, what's your instant go-to? What's your framing of that young man or boy? And I talk about this in the book, but also in the free resource. But I think there are some key points we need to take away from this. Masculinity is not inherently harmful. Young men and boys need safe spaces to explore identity without sticking to social scripts. We've got to move beyond these deficit models. And by deficit model, I mean, stop looking at, as a society, at young men and boys as potential problems and negatively. And this importance of intersectionality and inclusion. And here are some quotes from the boys on the project. So this was a young man, aged 15. He said, "I don't even know what a normal boy is supposed to be anymore. You get told so many different things and they all contradict each other." So what needs to change? We need systemic approaches in education and policy. We need those things to change. You know, there has to be a top-down and a bottom-up approach to this. The role of professionals in creating safe spaces has to be really taken seriously within an education and youth setting. We need to listen to young men and boys without judgment, but really listen to them. You know, we might not like what we hear, you know, but that's the only way that we're going to ensure that really positive outcomes for everyone. And like I said, reflect on our own positions. So this is another young man, aged 16. There's no place for how we actually feel. We just have to get on with it, and we are told not to be soft. You get told to man up even when everything is just a bit too much. It's not that we don't want to talk, it's that nobody listens when we do. And we need to remember that masculinity and boyhood is not monolithic. So what I mean is identity. Who we are is not one thing. Being a boy is not one thing. It means different things to different boys. So here's another boy here, age 14. It's like there's a blueprint of how you have to be seen as a man. You have to tick all the boxes. Don't cry, be tough, fix things. Don't ever be vulnerable. It's exhausting. So really what I'd like you to take away from the webinar today is that we need to rethink how we respond and see young men and boys within society. We need to reframe how we observe them and the lens that we look at them through, and then we need to respond according to that. So another young man, age 15, you get beaten down. You get beaten down until you don't care anymore. And that's when you become the kind of boy that they expect. Another young man, age 14, no one ever asks us what we think. They just tell us what not to do, like we're problems to fix instead of people to talk to. Another young man, age 14, I feel like being a man is something that is seen as quite a negative thing in our lives right now. We are always told we are part of the problem, but never allowed to be part of the solution. So again, bringing it back just to close, the book will be out soon, but there's a free resource that's out now. That's the darker one, the one on the left. We're in this together, Reframing Masculinity for Young Men and Boys, that breaks down all of those concepts that I've talked about and all of the concepts in the book for use for parents, educators and professionals. So there's I put all of my work on social media. So I've got a work Instagram, I work TikTok, and everything I do, I put on LinkedIn as well. So I'll stop sharing there and hand back over to Nick.
What a fantastic presentation. Thank you, Sophie. That's so rich. It's incredible.